The next item of business is Members' Business Debate on Motion 18420 in the name of Monica Lennon on Scotland's drug death public health emergency. And this debate will be concluded without any questions being put. May I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons. And before I call the opening contribution, can I say to all members, this debate is very highly subscribed, and so people will have to be very, very tight on their timings, or some members will have to drop off the speakers list. So it's in your hands. And I call on Monica Lennon to open the debate for up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every 7 hours, a life in Scotland is being lost to drug overdose. This is a national emergency and it needs an urgent emergency response. So I'm grateful to the members who signed my motion, because in doing so, they have made it possible for this debate to go ahead today and for Scotland's drug death emergency to be recognised in our national parliament. I know we are tight for time, so we do need to have a longer debate in government time and to have regular updates, because that is the very least that we can do. One drug-related death is a tragedy. One is a tragedy. So it is horrifying that almost 1,200 people died from drug overdose during 2018. The death toll has doubled in a decade. And if that wasn't shocking enough, Scotland's drug death rate is the highest in the UK, the highest in Europe, the highest in the world. Presiding Officer, thousands of grieving, trauma-stricken families are being left behind, and they feel ignored and abandoned by us and our public services. Those who have died for the purposes of officialdom and statistics are described as drug users or addicts, but they are and they were people. And they once had hopes and dreams like all of us. When I look around the chamber, I see members who are sincere in wanting to tackle this crisis. But we must not kid ourselves that we are doing enough. When I picked up the programme for government unveiled by the First Minister last week, I was shocked when I flicked to page 102 and read the words, "We are doing everything we can to save lives." This can't be serious. Now, as someone who's lost a parent to alcoholism, I have the self-awareness to know that I get a bit emotional about this. I have a heightened emotional response. But the First Minister is kidding herself on if she thinks that there isn't more that her government can do. Because treatment and support services are underfunded and struggling to provide help to everyone who needs it. Our prisons are rife with drugs. Drug users are still called horrible and dehumanising names, whether it's on the streets or in newspapers. And stigma is real, and stigma kills. Over half of people in Scotland believe that if someone goes through a hospital door because of drugs or alcohol misuse, they should pay something towards their care. Mothers and fathers are burying their sons and daughters. Children are being left without their parents. Friends are losing multiple friends to drug-related illness and suicide. And the statistics probably don't even tell the full story. Over 6,000 people, 6,418 families lost a loved one during the lifetime of the Scottish Government's 2008 Road to Recovery strategy. Presiding Officer, Scotland's drug death emergency is tragic, it is heart-wrenching, and this is shameful, and it cannot be allowed to continue. Now, the programme for government clearly states that drug-related deaths are preventable. And on this, ministers are absolutely correct. The motion we are debating is asking the Scottish Government to legally designate a public health emergency, not just talk about one. The legislation which allows ministers to do this and bring forward regulations, if so required, is the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. SPICE, the Scottish Parliament's highly respected and independent research unit, has confirmed this. And the Government's Preparing Scotland document explains the Act is concerned with how to deal with consequences of emergencies, which it defines as events that threaten serious damage to human life. And what would this legal designation do? Well, it would allow ministers to direct and coordinate and monitor the response of our public bodies, health boards, local councils, the police, to make sure that our communities and our people are getting exactly what they need. The situation in Dundee, which my colleague, if I just can continue, the situation in Dundee, which my colleague Jenny Marra will address, is quite different from what's happening in other parts of the country, like, for example, in Glasgow. So we need to know that targeted action and progress is being achieved. There needs to be transparency, there needs to be accountability. I don't know if I'm going to get extra time to take an intervention. I'm really sorry to Stuart McMillan. We know that alcohol and drug services have faced real-term cuts in recent years, and that's made it very difficult to support everyone. So an emergency response must be supported by the resources to address this. This morning in the Parliament, there was an event in partnership with the Daily Record that gave people who have direct experience of substance misuse the chance to be heard and be visible in Parliament. Many of them, there's a lot of them, they're in the public gallery, and I want to thank all of them, including my constituents who've come from Hamilton. I know that Blameless are represented who are based at Hamilton Accies, and I want to thank the Minister for being there today. I thank the Daily Record for their campaign to put the drug death emergency higher up the political agenda. And I thank Mark McGivern, the journalist who's largely been driving that. Today, MSPs from all of the parties have signed up to a Daily Record pledge board, and that's really positive. And I hope that all MSPs will sign it, including the Public Health Minister, because that pledge is about recognising that Scotland faces a drug death crisis that should be treated as a national emergency, that we pledge to do everything we can to end the crisis of substance misuse in every part of Scotland, and to campaign for significant new funding to help fund harm reduction and recovery services. Because we can't stand by and watch vulnerable people die every 7 hours. We are supposed to be a progressive and compassionate country. It's not good enough to announce a ministerial task force in March, to count our dead in July, and to wait until the middle of September to get people in a room. The task force will be accountable to ministers, but in the end, ministers will be accountable to the people. So when the Minister gets to his feet, will he confirm if he believes government has acted quickly enough? Is there more that can be done? And does he expect to see a reduction in drug deaths where the 2019 figures are published? In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am asking, I am urging, I am begging the Scottish Government to show the leadership I know it can show and the compassion, activate and coordinate an emergency response to this national tragedy. Our most vulnerable citizens cannot be left to die from preventable disease.
Can I say to those in the public gallery, please, it's inappropriate to show appreciation or otherwise in members' contributions. Perhaps at the end, you can speak to those who've contributed. We now move to the open debate and speeches of no more than 4 minutes, please. John Mason, followed by Miles Briggs.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Monica Lennon for raising this very important subject today here in Parliament. Can I also start by welcoming the extra 20 million that the Government has promised in its programme for government. And I appreciate getting the opportunity to speak in the drug death debate today, although I have to say I'm sad that we are having to have a debate on this topic at all. Scotland clearly has a serious drug problem, a problem that is very evident in my constituency of Glasgow-Shettleston, where both drug addiction and drug deaths are highly visible. I think I'd like to make two main points today. Firstly, we need to recognise there are usually underlying reasons for drug use, and the drugs themselves may be the result of something deeper. And secondly, I absolutely agree we should treat this as a health issue, while accepting that there are impacts beyond just health. So firstly, I would suggest that with most addictions, including drugs, people often have underlying problems, including, for example, breakdown of family relationships, major financial problems, mental health issues, lack of hope, and so on. So we cannot just deal with the drug usage on its own, but we do need to take a wider and a preventative approach to the whole issue. In this respect, I do not believe there is one simple solution. This is urgent, but it is going to take time to turn around. In this regard, I note that the motion focuses almost exclusively on the public sector, and absolutely the public sector is a major player. But I do not believe the public sector on its own is able to prevent deaths linked to drugs. For a start, families in the third sector have a very major part to play as well. They can give individuals the time and the support that they need, which frankly the public sector is unable to do. I'm sorry, the time is too limited. I was interested also in an Evening Times article this week, who have also been campaigning on this on Monday, which focused on the Family Addiction Support Service, FASS. One of the volunteers was quoted, and she was saying that she had a son aged 50 who had been involved with drugs for 30 years. And she makes the point that individuals themselves have to want to change. And this is an important point, I think, for us to remember when we say that all drug deaths are preventable. Secondly, I agree that this is a health issue and we should treat it as a health problem or crisis or emergency as people see fit. Therefore, I do think that safe consumption rooms can be part of the answer. My question on this is, if other parts of the NHS both look after the patient and provide the medication required, surely that should be the case with drugs too. A system which relies on people buying their drugs illegally from organised criminals, perhaps forcing a partner into prostitution to get the money, as I'm afraid happens in my constituency, and with drug gangs being involved, which leads on to violence, cannot be a good system. So if this is a health issue, as it is, I would argue that we need to emphasise the likes of heroin-assisted treatment as the preferred route. I understand HAT is already legal, although there are a number of conditions around it, and perhaps these are too restrictive and need to be reviewed. I gather that Switzerland has a long history of providing HAT. The Swiss model of HAT combines prescribed supply with the associated benefits that it incurs, such as purity, with supervised use in a safe and hygienic facility. Since the introduction of HAT in Switzerland, I understand health outcomes for heroin users have improved significantly. Illicit heroin consumption has been reduced, medically prescribed heroin has not made its way into illicit markets, and medicalisation of heroin has reduced initiation of it by new users. In the UK, medically prescribed heroin has been legal since 1926, yet programmes are not widely available. Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership are pushing ahead with plans to open an HAT centre in Glasgow, and I very much welcome that. But let's remember that this is a long-running problem, and sadly, the answers will not be quick or easy. Thank you.
Miles Briggs, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I start by thanking Monica Lennon and the Labour Party for bringing forward this debate today. This is the second opportunity we've had to actually discuss drug deaths, the last being when Conservatives had to use their business to bring forward this. So I hope the Minister has heard that message, that we should have government debate time on this, and I hope that's something we'll be bringing forward as soon as possible. Now, over the summer recess, I've undertook a number of visits across Scotland to meet with people who are running drug services, because I think we need to start by looking where have we gone so wrong. And from people working on the front line, it's quite clear that this is a public health emergency, but one that they can't actually meet because of lack of resource. And I think that's something we need to be absolutely clear about from the very start. I visited the Minister's own constituency, where I met with people in the Lockheed hub there. Now, they were telling me in terms of adult services with AdAction, the work they were doing, which was making a difference. But the same people also told me that Youth AdAction had had all their services cut in all the secondary schools and primary schools within Dundee after the cuts this government made to funding. Now, that has had an impact on services, and I'm really concerned that actually, as we stand here today, services across Scotland are being threatened and are closing. So we need to see action from the government now to look at that and to prevent these services from closing as well. Now, one of the areas which I have picked up and I think is really important, and I hope we will not just wait for the task force to take this forward, but is around mental health support. Because it's quite clear from everyone I've spoken to that actually you aren't able to start any sort of holistic support around mental health until you're seen as being clean or actually being under management. I think that's wrong because most people want to start that support straight away. So that's something we need to look at capacity. Now, we have debates in here around access to mental health services, the CAMHS crisis. It's not going to be clear where that is going to come from and what it's going to look like. But I think we have to look at where the third sector can really step in to support that. Now, on the issue of the task force, in the time that I've got today, I wanted to be clear that I welcome the task force, we've said that, and those who are serving on it. But I think it's quite clear that families and people with lived experience do not feel there is an adequate level of representation for them on the task force. Now, there's lots of organisations that I know many are represented in the chamber today, and I welcome all the positive work that they do, but just feeding in that experience, I don't think they have the confidence that they'll actually have their voice heard. So can I ask the Minister at this stage if he would consider including more people with lived experience and from families as well to be included on the task force and to expand it? It's an ask they're putting forward, and I think it's a sensible one, and I think would attract cross-party support today. Above all, that strategy, above all, the task force, as it brings forward positive, I hope, contributions to how we can turn this around, I hope we see that commissioned on an ongoing basis. And I know already, as Monica Lennon has mentioned, that the Minister's agreed to meet with us on a monthly basis. I think we need to, as a Parliament, really drive forward change and drive forward a reform of services. The Minister, like I say, has agreed to that, and I hope that can be something which we can have a whole Parliament-wide view on this. Also, in terms of a cross-party effort, it's quite clear that every party in here is committed to try to bring forward change. And policy suggestions we've all put forward. I last year published our life plan policy. I hope we can actually look at each of these policy areas we want to see change and reform and not just have them put to one side. This is a national emergency, and we need the Scottish Government and every minister to look towards their own portfolios collectively and take responsibility. Local government, the health service and our education service are all going to have to step up to take an emergency response to this. I hope we see that, and I hope when we have a proper government debate on this that we'll have all ministers able to take part in that. Thank you.
Emma Harper, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be speaking in the debate and thank Monica Lennon for bringing it forward. From the outset, I want to express my condolences for any family who have lost loved ones who have died as a result of the effects of alcohol or drugs use. Everyone involved who has experienced harm from use and misuse of alcohol or drugs must be treated with dignity, respect and must be supported. I also want to put on record my thanks to the Minister for his work that I know he has put into this issue. He visited Paris during recess to observe and listen to their approaches. There's been documents published and he's given this issue time, and the issue is claiming so many lives, as we have rightly heard earlier. It is a complex issue, and I've got so many notes in front of me just from even attending the round table this morning and hearing about the experiences, the lived experiences from the people speaking about it. But as a nurse, I can talk about the complex physiological issue that's happening to people who are overdosing. Sometimes the folks that are having effects of harmful use are also smokers. Smokers have often issues related to lung poor health. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease leads to baseline oxygen saturation levels that are maybe not the healthiest. And then when other drugs are taken on top of that, it can lead to an over-sedation an over-sedation issue in the body, which causes further oxygen saturation reduction, leading to critical events. So even if we have safe consumption facilities, many of the people who are taking drugs in rural areas would not necessarily have access to these facilities. But when people take drugs on their own, that is a real risk as well, and that's something that has to be addressed and challenged, especially in rural areas. I also would like to thank the Minister for attending River Garden at Auchincruive in Ayrshire with me earlier, just before recess. The charity run by IFDAS, Independence from Drugs and Alcohol Scotland, is run by a great team of people, including the service users. It's a peer-supported place where people who have lived experience can live together, work together and support each other. And, you know, just listening to the experiences of Natalie, Sharon and Darren this morning, that is part of helping. And the Minister noted Darren's passion for speaking, following an apology from Darren for being so aggressive. And the Minister said if we lose our passion, it means we don't care anymore. So we need to make sure that we do continue that passion and care so that we can help save more Scottish lives. I am interested in the information about the Scottish Affairs Committee that pursued this in Westminster. I was able to attend Westminster with colleagues Dave Stewart and Brian Whittle, and I see Jed Killen is in the chamber today. He is a member, MP and a member of the Scottish Affairs Committee. So the Scottish Affairs Committee are looking at an inquiry with a simple aim to better understand the issue of drug misuse in Scotland. And the session I attended, we took evidence from many experts who are also asking for radical change, experts like Professor Ian McPhee from the University of the West of Scotland. One of the things I think we do have challenges with is the fact that we can't just change the policies and do what we want. So I would ask the Minister to continue to lobby the UK government so that we can do things different, just like they have done in Portugal and in other countries across Europe since the 70s. So I will stop there, but I think this is worth further debate in the future. Thank you.
Neil Finlay, followed by Shona Robson.
Presiding Officer, I want to thank Monica Lennon for bringing forward this debate, but I think it says everything about the government's approach to this national crisis, that we're only debating drug deaths in opposition time. Surely a non-debate about a citizens' assembly does not have a greater priority than discussing how we end our shameful accolade as a drugs death capital of Europe, or how we end the HIV outbreak amongst homeless drug injectors in Glasgow. You know the last time we debated drugs in government time in this Parliament? It was the 8th of November 2012, 7 years ago, when half the number of people were dying on the street. That is simply not good enough. And people say we have to have consensus over this. I disagree with that 100%. It's passive consensus that's got us to the situation we are at the moment, and we need anger and we need direction to government over this issue. That's what we need. Because the government's response has been pathetic. We had a 24% cut in the budget for alcohol and drugs partnerships in 2016, and I'm very pleased to see the former Cabinet Secretary here, and I hope she contributes to the debate, because she can explain why under her watch those very ADPs had that massive cut in their budget, resulting in poorer care, poorer attention for people who are going through addiction, and more people dying on the streets. A task force was set up. It hasn't met for the 6 months since it was announced. That exemplifies the problem. And we see a paltry £10 million over the next 2 years of additional funding. That exemplifies the ambivalence being shown. Let me put this into context. We're going to spend £1.4 million a month to keep a hospital in Edinburgh closed with no patients. We're going to spend an extra £76 million on an IT disaster to deliver farm payments. So we're spending £76 million on computers that didn't work, and we're spending millions on a hospital with no patients. But we're just spending a fraction of that, Minister, on our fellow citizens who are dying on the streets of this city and every other city and community every single day. And you know, if this was bird flu, if this was foot and mouth disease, or if it was a health threat to animals or another disease, there would be emergency meetings of the resilience division in the government. Resources would be freed up immediately. There would be a genuine emergency response. If any task force set up to deal with that hadn't met for 6 months, you would have been out the door a long time ago, Minister. But of course, it's only drug users. It's only people going through addiction, because politically they are easy to ignore. And to this government, they are miles down the list of priorities. Now, here's some of the suggestions that I have heard from people who are drugs users, people who have been supporting them, people who are in their families. They've said to me, stop jailing people who are unwell and need help and treat them instead. They've said bring police, community and public health funding together to address the problems that people are facing. Set up mental health teams in police stations. This was the top ask from the police themselves when I went out on a shift with them over the summer. Allow drug users who have not responded to other forms of treatment to be prescribed heroin in a medical setting. Extend the application of naloxone. Have an early warning system for changes in behaviour on the streets. And stop cutting alcohol and drug partnership budgets and properly invest in mental health services, because the services that are there at the moment are completely and utterly swamped and inadequate. And people will talk warmly about the charities and voluntary organisations in their area. All of them have had their budget cut year on year on year. That's the reality. We should be extending the testing of ecstasy and other drugs. We should be taking action, long-term gradualist action against the prevalence of antidepressants so that people are not going on the streets to pick up counterfeit. We need a concerted and coordinated drugs service. And we need to stop discharging people from hospital onto the streets and address the homelessness crisis that we have. There's so much more I want to say, but please, let's not have any more guff about consensus. We need to get things fixed.
All parties, Greens aside, have had their first speakers go over time. I cannot allow anyone else to go over time because this chamber must resume again at the normal time on a Thursday. So Shona Robson, followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start by welcoming Monica Lennon's debate and also the very powerful speech that she made at the outset. I also want to welcome the proposals set out by the Scottish Government in last week's statement on tackling drug-related deaths. Everyone in this chamber and those who are not in this chamber care deeply about this issue, whether it's in our communities or indeed having affected many of our friends and families. I echo the sentiment expressed by the Minister when he met the new chair of the Scottish Government's Drug Death Task Force, that the group needs to identify areas for change or improvement quickly rather than meet for months and then issue a final report. That is absolutely the right approach. The task force meets for the first time on the 17th of September. So in his response, can the Minister say if a timescale for output in relation to their remit has been discussed and agreed? I also understand that the task force will report to ministers and make recommendations for short, medium and long-term actions. Given the need to act now, will the Minister agree to allot time to provide regular updates of the progress of the task force, given the concerns shared by so many members across this chamber? In his statement, the Minister acknowledged the work of the Dundee Drugs Commission, who of course recently published its report responding to drug use with kindness, compassion and hope, which was presented by the Dundee Partnership. And I too would like to thank those involved in the report, especially those who have been directly affected, for the work that they've done in highlighting the issues faced in Dundee and across Scotland, and for their numerous recommendations, many of which have been acknowledged in the Scottish Government's own strategy documents. I was impressed when I met with some of the commissioners about how they are looking at very radical and different approaches, which is absolutely, again, the right course of action. One of the key recommendations in the report was the recommendation for the full integration of substance use and mental health services, something Miles Briggs touched on earlier, and support and its need in Dundee, particularly to join those services. They have been far too siloed, and the idea that someone cannot access services because potentially of an underlying mental health issue is not the right approach. We have to integrate those services. Trauma, violence, neglect and social inequalities lie at the root of both mental health problems and substance use problems, and we know the interlinking. And the idea, of course, that there is one simple solution to this, I don't think anyone would advocate that. There is, no thank you, I've only got 4 minutes. The idea that there is one simple solution to this is not something I think that, that is being suggested. We have to look at all of the potential solutions, some very radical, some that perhaps wouldn't have even been raised as a possibility 10 years ago in this place, but are now being discussed openly and have support across this chamber. It is absolutely the time for radical action, and we all need to look to that and be willing to open our eyes to that, and I certainly am one of those. Given the potential for such an approach and the need for urgent action, I'm pleased that the Minister is meeting with me later on to discuss the recommendations, particularly those about dual diagnosis in more detail. And I would like, if he could, touch on how Dundee could be at the forefront of that implementation, because we do have complex issues in Dundee, and it is right that we look at a strategy that looks at the needs of particular locations, because there isn't one solution here for the whole of Scotland, and I would like the Minister to reflect on that in his closing remarks. Thank you.
Brian Whittle, followed by Sandra White.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also congratulate Monica Lennon for bringing this debate to the Chamber, and agree that it's about time we had significant government debating time for this topic. Can I start, Deputy Presiding Officer, for saying that for far too long, too many people in society haven't mattered. And it's just those, not just those who are caught in the web of addiction that are suffering. It's families, friends and local communities who have suffered the emotional fallout from addiction and the trauma of losing loved ones to addiction. Now I was introduced to a very uncomfortable phrase, and that phrase is, there is a hierarchy of death. The suggestion is that the way in which the bereaved are treated depends on how the deceased died. And they say that the bottom of that hierarchy are families and communities who have lost loved ones to addiction. And they are, of course, correct. So when we are discussing drug and alcohol deaths, let's make sure we do not forget the devastation that is left behind, no matter what is written on a death certificate. The pain and trauma left behind is the same, so we need to develop services accordingly. Now, I attended an event recently called A Matter of Life and Death Recovery in East Ayrshire, of which there was 110 stakeholders took place. And there were several presentations, including from the leader of the government's Drug Death Task Force, Professor Katrina Matthews. Now, in the breakout sessions, I have to say that not one of the actions called for by those 110 stakeholders lies out with the competency of the Scottish Government. So when I reread the Minister's statement from last week on the Scotland's drug deaths, I was disappointed all over again. Now, I would not question the Minister's commitment and desire to tackle this issue, but it is blatantly obvious to me that the Scottish Government are going on the wrong road. They continually talk about the levers that they don't have and keep looking south to suggest that their hands are tied. And I have to say, I think you're hiding behind that excuse. And your options are being strangled by that narrow approach. Now, we do want safe spaces where further conversations can happen. And in East Ayrshire, they're trying to raise the cash, and it's not much in the scheme of things, to open a rehabilitation cafe, a safe space where medical interventions like hepatitis and AIDS testing can take place, where mental and physical health advice can be accessed, where dental health can be accessed. Now, these interventions are successful around the country, so we don't always need to reinvent a wheel. There are many people and organisations out there in the front line with lived experiences doing fantastic work. Much of the solution is about supporting and developing what is already working. The most effective tools we have at our disposal to tackle this crisis lie in education, health and the third sector. And the responsibility for which has been totally devolved to this Parliament for 20 years. And I have to say to this chamber that successive governments' inability to create that legislation, investment and focus to this issue is an abject failure of this Parliament. And make no mistake, this Scottish Government has a significant toolbox to radically alter the approach to addiction and therefore the outcomes. And the one other thing I'm going to raise, something that was raised by Miles Briggs, is this: to regain control of any kind of addiction requires good mental health. We must stop the practice of withholding mental health treatment until an addict has stopped their habit, because many are self-medicating to mask the pain of previous trauma. So without that mental health intervention, there would be no way to mask the pain they seek to deaden. So in so many cases, a mental health intervention should be the initial starting point. Treat the cause, not the symptom. It was Hippocrates that said, better to know the person with the disease than know the disease that the person has. And I know I have to stop. There are so many things I would like to say, but again, thank you to Monica Lennon, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Before we move on to Sandra White, I still have a few members who wish to speak in the debate. So I'm minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. And I invite Monica Lennon to move that motion without notice.
Moved.
Thank you. Question is that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. That does not mean you have another 30 minutes, may I say. So even tighter, and I would ask remaining speakers to aim for 3.5 minutes. Sandra White, followed by Jenny Mara.
And can I thank Monica Lennon for securing this debate and for her very informed contribution, and welcome the people to the gallery. Presiding Officer, I represent part of Glasgow City Centre, and unfortunately drug death is rife in that particular area. And having spoken to the professionals in Glasgow City Council, Greater Glasgow Health Board, it is obvious to everyone that a unified approach is needed. Yes, I think we need the drug consumption room, but I also think that's only one of the processes, and I would ask colleagues, in fact we have in this Parliament and the City Council and in Westminster, you know, together said we would support the consumption room. So I would like that to happen also, but that is unfortunately in the wishes of the UK Parliament. But I don't want to get involved in the absolute politics of this altogether. This is about people. This is about real people, which we will see, and I certainly see every day in my constituency. If it's not in Glasgow City Centre or the Merchant City, it's in other areas of the constituency. And it's not just the fact that it's the drugs. It needs a holistic approach for what's causing the fact that people are, one, driven to take drugs in some aspects of it, and also the austerity aspects. You've also got the situation from Westminster, I must say that again, in regards to people not being able to live, can't afford to live, and people with mental health problems not being given anything at all, being sanctioned. It's all got to be looked at holistically. We've got to look at housing and health, and it is absolutely a public health matter. And I thank the Minister and others for recognising, I don't have time, sorry Jenny, for recognising the fact that it is a public health matter. So we can't just concentrate on one area, we've got to concentrate on all the areas. And I know I haven't much time, I want to give this part of the situation, the drug use, something that never gets covered at all. These people are called the train spotting generation. And during the 80s and 90s, a significant increase in the problem of drug taking in Edinburgh and in Glasgow and other cities also. Now, obviously we know about the film of Train Spotting, but it's not said enough that a lot of these people are dying. In fact, last year, more than 2/3 of drug-related deaths were aged between 35 and 54. And that's not just because of the drug that they were using, but because of the add-on, their age, they develop, you know, multiple morbidity and respiratory diseases, etc. And we've got to recognise that also, but we want to prevent it getting to that. But I will repeat this figure again. More than 2/3 of drug-related deaths last year were aged between 35 and 54. And I don't think we should forget these people as well when we look at other aspects of drug death. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Jenny Mara, followed by Alison Johnson.
Presiding Officer, this morning the presenter on Reporting Scotland quoted the Scottish Government's reaction to drugs death. She said, "The power to reduce drugs deaths is reserved to Westminster." Simple, full stop, washing their hands of this, and not completely true. That's what she quoted the Scottish Government as saying this morning. But many more people watching their televisions this morning and all day today will hear that line of blame, many more than will hear the complexity of this debate in this chamber today and what the Scottish Government can actually do. My colleague Neil Finlay has listed about, I think, 16 things he told me that the Scottish Government can do. I think the list is endless on this, and I think the Minister appreciates that as well. Let me add, firstly, a couple of small points to that list. Minister, why don't we know locally how many drug users are receiving treatment? Because we know that treatment can save lives. In some European countries, 80% of problem drug users are in treatment. In England, they managed to treat 60%. Scotland, we manage 40%, less than half. But we don't even have the information to tell us how many people are in treatment in areas where we have particular problems. You and I don't know, despite the fact we represent Dundee and the area, what percentage of problem drug users are receiving treatment. Frankly, I think that is a disgrace. And my feeling on it, given all the other evidence I have seen, is that we in Dundee have an even lower treatment rate. But the government will not collect the information to allow us to discover that and allow us to plan those services for people properly. Now, the lack of data is a technical issue, but is an important issue. And it's one the Public Audit Committee has raised many times. And I hope the Minister will make a commitment today to start collecting this information so we can plan our drug services properly. Presiding Officer, let me turn to the Dundee Drugs Commission. It reported last month, and it made for grim reading. They said that drug services in Dundee, this is the NHS drug service in the city, was not fit for purpose. And I understand that an earlier draft had even proposed shutting down the NHS service altogether because it was failing so badly and starting again. The Commission, and I quote from the document, said that the service is entirely unaccountable, has no oversight, has been making maverick policy decisions without reference to best practice for years, and at times has willfully ignored national and regional policy on prescribing and drugs policy. There is almost no data, the Commission said, to understand the impact of the Dundee Drug Services action. And finally, the service itself refused to cooperate with the Commission, despite the fact it had the support of the Council, the NHS, and all of us politically to do its work. And they blocked access to the information that was vitally needed by the Commission. Frankly, it's an utter disgrace, and I would like to hear the Minister's reaction to that too. The Dundee Drugs Commission did not take any evidence on safe consumption rooms. Now, the Minister knows that Scottish Labour have voted in this chamber to support the transfer of powers. But I believe there are some real issues we need to debate around the technicalities of this, issues that Police Scotland have raised with me. Unfortunately, there isn't even time today, Presiding Officer, to raise these, and that's why I would urge the Minister again to have, I think, a week-long debate on this, but if he can't agree to that, then at least one. Presiding Officer, please let me say, I think this is a public health crisis. I think it is a human crisis. My fellow citizens, my age, mums and dads are dying in their droves. I think the Scottish Government owes it to them to at least debate this properly.
I have let you say it, Ms Mara, but it may affect your colleagues' time in speaking. And I call Alison Johnson to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too would like to thank Monica Lennon for bringing this debate to Parliament today. It truly is a national shame and scandal that so many have had their lives destroyed by drugs. Greens have always been clear that this is a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. It's now a public health emergency. When it comes to drugs, criminalisation has caused more harm than it can claim to have prevented. The war on drugs approach has clearly failed, and no wonder. Addiction is a complex illness, so it's clearly better tackled by trained medical professionals, not the courts. And we heard from contributors at today's meeting that we all need to take responsibility for this, and we all need to help Scotland to get better. Now, Portugal used to suffer from the kind of drug-related death rate and levels of HIV infection that Scotland is currently experiencing. The radical change in their law in 2001 decriminalised the use of all drugs, though not their production and supply, and subsequent years have seen dramatic drops in problematic drug use, in HIV and hepatitis infection too, in overdose deaths, in drug-related crime and in incarceration rates. So the success of this model clearly demonstrates that decriminalising possession while adopting a health-based approach to substance use problems can dramatically reduce drug deaths. I'm heartened we're discussing that model, and with a death due to drugs every 7 hours in Scotland, we need action and proper funding for that action. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights said on decriminalisation in Portugal that it was based on humanism, on courage, on participation and evidence. And in the face of this public health emergency, we need all of those. We support the introduction of safe consumption rooms. They've been operating in Europe for the last 30 years. It is disappointing that Westminster is being resistant to this potentially life-saving change. But it is clear that these rooms alone aren't a solution. Addiction as a root cause, not just addiction to a particular drug, needs to be addressed and treated. And we need to address the trauma that causes the addiction in the first place. So a trauma-informed workforce is key. And it's a really cruel paradox that as drug problems worsen, drug users become even more maligned. So we need to address the stigma that continues to surround drug users and treat addiction as an illness, not a personal failure. We need to respond to the emotional pain and the shame experienced by addicts and their families and friends. No one should ever be ashamed of being ill. In terms of treatment, we need intervention from our multidisciplinary health teams. We need the third sector. Pharmacists have got an important role to play too in intervening and reducing drug dependency. In the last 2 years, community pharmacists in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have saved 15 lives through the administration of naloxone to patients who have overdosed on opiates. This must be widely available. We've got to address the wider health and social inequalities that Sandra White mentioned. Health and social care is one aspect, but we need housing, we need employment support, we need financial advice. We need care for prisoners. We need care for people who are coming out of prison. People being left on their own when they leave prison, sometimes at a weekend, is simply unacceptable and just leads back into a circle of addiction. The Health and Sport Committee had an inquiry on this. We know what needs to be done. This issue really does affect people of all ages and stages. I want to make sure that we get the proper voices, the right people into the task force. We need that lived experience. We need the voices of families. We need to make sure that beds in rehab facilities aren't lying empty while people are desperate to access them. The Edinburgh Access practice in my region is doing a fabulous job. We need those non-judgmental services. You know, they need to be there when people need them. The workers in the access practice have told me they know which sofas to find the people they need to find on. In closing, Presiding Officer, I heard this morning from one contributor, if nothing changes, nothing changes. We need change now. Thank you.
Bob Doris, followed by James Kelly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I want to thank Monica Lennon for providing us with the opportunity to debate the self-evident public health emergency of drugs deaths in Scotland. Unity of purpose across government and opposition parties will be crucial. We look at solutions and the consequent funding that will be required. We must listen carefully to those with direct experience of drug use and addiction. It is their experiences that will base my comments this afternoon. My comments will be the thoughts of various individuals in my constituency, Maryhill and Springburn, with lived experience that I have met in recent times, many who have lost loved ones. When I met with constituents ahead of the drugs death vigil that was organised in George Square, the testimony I heard was challenging and harrowing, but cannot be ignored. And I met them again this morning at Monica Lennon's event. I also visited the Springburn Addictions Recovery Cafe to speak to several volunteers there. All of them have direct lived experience and have progressed through recovery. People are dying in my constituency, in Maryhill, in Possil, in Springburn, right across the constituency. It's not just a tragedy, of course it's a public health emergency. I was told stories of those pursuing recovery being refused lower doses of methadone by their GP, despite trying to move into recovery. I heard of those who suffered a relapse but still committed to recovery, finding themselves placed on even higher doses of methadone when their GP found out, despite the fact that was higher than the methadone they were on before they sought recovery in the first place, something they didn't want. I've heard similar stories of constituents and their experiences with addiction workers. On occasions, addiction workers were actively discouraging individuals from moving into recovery or into abstinence-based programmes. It was unclear why some in the addictions field were doing so. Explanations offered to me by those with lived experience included it was cultural within addiction services. Not enough people have been through recovery, were part of addiction services, support pathways were weak or didn't exist or were not joined up. Addiction services were poorly resourced. Addiction workers had too many clients and didn't feel they give the individualised support that would be required. I want to stress that I heard good things about GPs and addiction workers also. I should put that on there. I just don't have time, Mr Finlay, I'm sorry. The Drugs Task Force will meet shortly. I welcome that, but it will be judged not by its meetings but by its actions, so the jury's obviously out on that. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the concerns that exist about the lack of lived experience in addictions and recovery on that. But I suggest that, yes, we need more direct representation on that, but I think we have to do something similar to what we did with the Social Security Scotland Bill, and that is we need an addiction and recovery experience panel, not meeting as a one-off, as a gimmick, but actually meeting regularly and feeding directly into the lived experience of those in recovery into the task force work on an ongoing basis. I hope that's something the government can agree to. And I also want to talk about Reverend Brian Casey in my constituency from Springburn Parish. I commend Brian for the love and support he sought to show those in recovery. But he's also, in the last 5 years, 1/3 of all the funerals he's conducted has been drug-related deaths. And that's 1/3 of 500 funerals in Springburn. It's not acceptable. Something's got to change. What we're doing, self-evidently, is not working. Those families need policymakers and public agencies to act to try to stem this tide. Of course they do. A quick mention, Presiding Officer, street Valium is what's killing my constituents right now. We need a strategy directly for that as soon as possible also. But finally, we do need consensus, a new consensus, I have to say, and that consensus will have to come at budget time, when the unsavoury bun fighting between the parties must end, and we must decide the resource that's required in this place and the outcomes we want to drive. We must come together as a parliament.
The last of the open debate speakers is James Kelly.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank Monica Lennon for bringing this very important debate forward, and also congratulate the Daily Record for the campaign they have run to raise awareness of this national crisis. There's no doubt when you examine the statistics and you hear from the experiences of people, this is a really stark issue. One person a week in Scotland is murdered. 3 people die in road deaths. 15 people take their lives in suicides. But 22 people a week die from drugs deaths. That is absolutely stark and shows how serious the problem is. And I also have to say, back earlier in the year, we all gathered here to celebrate 20 years of the Scottish Parliament, and everybody made nice speeches and said what a great institution this was. But this particular area is a failure. It's a failure of devolution. It really is. You know, and we all have to take responsibility. The responsibility does start at the top. Back 10, 12 years ago, the government launched the Road to Recovery drug strategy. I supported that as an MSP at the time. I spoke at events and I spoke in the chamber. And we have to acknowledge that that has not worked. In that time, drugs deaths have more than doubled. So there's a real issue here, and there's a big challenge for us all as a parliament, but particularly for the government to do so much more. I think the government needs to be drawing in more expertise from people who internationally and also in Scotland who know more about these issues. I think we need to acknowledge that that expertise hasn't been drawn on in the last 10, 12 years. I also find it astonishing that the task force that's been set up has only got one person on it that's actually got lived experience of drug use and addiction. I think that's a real failing. I think what needs to happen is every spending priority and every policy needs to be tested against how it is going to assist in tackling this crisis. So, for example, during the summer, the government suspended through care in the prison service, and it's known that one of the areas that's really vulnerable is prisoners leaving prison and going into society, that they're in a vulnerable position, and some sadly succumb to drugs again and end up passing away. But the government, by suspending that through care service, is increasing the number of vulnerable people who are leaving prisons into society. And that happened during the summer, and even now we still don't have a date when that through care service is going to be reintroduced. What I would say, what I would appeal to the government is, you know, you need to do, you're listening to the speeches and even FMQs, the government are far too defensive. I agree and support the call in terms of consumption rooms, but that is such a small part of the debate. You need to interact so much more with the other parties and with the people in the gallery. You really need to up your game, because if the government fails to do that and we fail as a parliament, then people and communities will continue to suffer, and that will be totally unacceptable. We'd be letting them down as MSPs.
I now call on Joe Fitzpatrick to respond to the debate for no more than 7 minutes, please.
First of all, I want to thank Monica Lennon for securing the debate. Also thank her for organising the meeting this morning, and thanks to the folk in the audience who spoke this morning. It is unfortunate that the forum here doesn't allow your words to go on the record in the Scottish Parliament. Maybe that's one of the things that we need to think about, how we can make sure that happens, because I do genuinely absolutely value that voice of lived experience and family members is absolutely crucial. So thanks, Monica, for making that happen. The fact is the numbers of people who have died last year, are continuing to die and died in the previous years, is a tragedy. And it's important, I think, for us all to remember that it's not just that big number. Whatever that number was, every single person who has died is a personal tragedy for them, for their family, for their friends, and I think it's important we put it all in that context. But when we put it together, there is no question that this is an emergency. This is a public health emergency. I think one of the good things is that I'm seeing nodding from across the board in the chamber that this is a public health emergency, and that's important, because you would not get that consensus in all parts of our democratic system, because there are parts of the UK where this is not, this is not considered to be a public health issue. This is considered to be a justice issue, and that's one of the challenges that we have in taking this forward. The motion, just about everything in the motion I agree with, and there's the one bit which, it's not that I don't agree with it, it's just that I can't do it. So the question about legally designating a crisis, a public health emergency, if I had levers within my power, I can assure members in this chamber that I would absolutely use them to do that, and it's good to see that there's support across the chamber for that. Monica Lennon is absolutely correct in identifying the Civil Contingency Act 2004 as being the piece of legislation that would allow such an emergency to be enacted. But unfortunately, and I'm absolutely not wanting to make this any constitutional issue, unfortunately, the specific powers to do that rest with the UK government. So, you know, if I can find any other ways within it, and I will continue to very quickly.
Monica Lennon.
Okay, I don't want to get into a legal argument right now, but is the Minister telling the Chamber that he cannot coordinate and liaise with and direct public bodies to do X, Y and Z, whatever that may be, because that is what we're looking for, an emergency response that we all know about, and report back to Parliament daily, weekly, monthly, whatever it takes, until we see lives being saved?
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Entirely different thing. So I don't have the powers to declare a legal emergency. That power rests with the UK government. Let's we all agree this is a public health emergency. So let's use the powers that are there. So let's call on our colleagues elsewhere to engage in this debate and make that happen, because it would be helpful, but it's not the only answer. In terms of getting agencies together, you know, that is exactly what we need to do. And so I do not need to declare a public health emergency, you know, legally do that in order to take that forward. That is what we want to do. That's what the strategy that was launched last November is aimed at doing, and I was very pleased for the range of support for that strategy from not just across this Parliament, but from people who with lived experience and from other people who are working right across Scotland, because that's important. That we take that. I don't think I can, because there's been a number of really important points made, and the presiding officer will get on to me if I don't manage to get through as many of them as possible. She won't let me go on because she can't, because the Chamber has to come back. One of the points that Monica Lennon made that I think is very, very important was around stigma. I've spent a lot of time speaking to as many people as I can with lived experience and supporting people who are going through treatment, and stigma is absolutely one of the barriers. So part of that is for us to lead by example and try and be careful about our language as politicians, to respect you know, people who are in treatment, and they shouldn't be somehow stigmatised in terms of whatever that treatment is. And I know there's a bit of debate about whether this treatment or that treatment, whatever treatment is deemed appropriate for someone to move as part of their treatment or recovery, then it is absolutely crucial that they are supported in that, in the round. One of the points that Bob Doris, Jenny Mara and I think other folk made was around what people's experiences are with that treatment, and I think that's one of the things that I've also heard from people with lived experience, and particularly, you know, I've had constituents who've come to me seeking support about how they can get the treatment they want, whether it's methadone or other forms of support, and the experience has not been what it should be. That's why it was really good that the Dundee Drugs Commission was so frank and so clear and gives some clear directions, but there's points in there for the whole of Scotland. So that's why in the Programme for Government we've included a commitment to developing a national pathway, so that, you know, that best practice around treatment we can make sure that's right across Scotland. I've heard the calls around respite as well, and people saying that they aren't having the choice. I don't personally feel that we should be putting one form of treatment above others. It needs to be what works for the individual, and what we need to understand is that given the level of complexity and the driving factors behind much of the addiction that a number of members had talked about, Shona Robinson and John Mason in particular talked about, you know, often it's some severe trauma has happened in someone's life that has been part of the process. So we need to be as supportive as we can be in taking that forward. Shona Robinson also mentioned the Dundee Drugs Commission in relation to their recommendation around mental health, and I think she is absolutely right that this is something that has been highlighted as a particular problem in Dundee. But again, I've spoken to people across the country, people who are in treatment, who are seeking treatment, and they're finding a barrier because they have a dual diagnosis. And it's not always just mental health and something else. We need to treat the person, we need to support the person. So that's why the announcement in the Programme for Government was there in relation to that dual diagnosis mental health, and I'll be pleased to have a further discussion with Shona Robinson about that after. I'm conscious of time is difficult, so there's a few points that I think I really want to make sure I'm covering. So in terms of...
The Minister's just closing, Ms Mara.
James Kelly made, I think, a really important point which hasn't really been discussed. I was equally concerned when I heard about the decision around the through care, and I'm really keen to make sure that we get some alternative support in there. Probably the support that was there before wasn't ideal, because I think from what I've been hearing is if that through care support was provided by people with peer experience, that might be far more useful in terms of taking people out. It's an area of vulnerability. The point that Alison Johnson made, most of the people we're talking about shouldn't be in prison anyway, and so we shouldn't be having to have that. But while we still have people in prison and coming out of prison, it's a crucial part of the jigsaw. In relation to the Drug Death Task Force, I'm happy to engage further with members. I think it will be absolutely crucial that the task force is able to hear from the widest range of lived experience. I know Professor Matheson is considering how she can do that, but I absolutely hear the points that it is absolutely important that that is heard. I've tried to get people in the room around that task force who will not just be talking, but they'll be the ones that hear that lived experience and then have to go and make things happen, because we need action. I get the point about there's been a lot of talking, and I hear people wanting more discussions, and that's fine. We'll have further debates, but it is important that we look at how we can take this forward in action. I thank the members for the way that they've taken this forward in debate, because I think there is something we can make a difference here, but it will be easier for us to make a real difference if we work together. So thank you.
That concludes the debate, and this meeting is suspended until 2:30.